On October 7, 1963, Bobby Baker resigned as Secretary to the Senate Majority. Baker had served in that role since Lyndon Johnson's tenure as Majority Leader. He was Johnson's fixer, his bagman, the man who knew where every dollar went and where it came from. The Senate Rules Committee was investigating Baker for kickbacks, influence peddling, and a vending machine scheme run through the Serv-U Corporation that had funneled money through government contracts. Johnson managed to stay clear of Baker publicly, but the distance was shrinking daily. Baker wasn't the only fire burning. Johnson was already rattled by the Billie Sol Estes scandal, a Texas cotton broker convicted of fraud and influence peddling with deep ties to Johnson's political orbit. And Fred Korth, a Texas friend of Johnson's, had just resigned as Secretary of the Navy over conflict of interest charges. Multiple criminal threads were converging simultaneously, and every single one pointed toward the vice president. The most dangerous date on the calendar was 6 weeks away. Don Reynolds, an insurance agent with first-hand knowledge of financial arrangements connecting Baker's operations to Johnson personally, was scheduled to testify before the Senate Rules Committee. Reynolds had already provided preliminary testimony detailing kickbacks, improper payments, and the specific financial pipeline between Baker and the vice president. His full appearance would be the moment the scandal stopped orbiting Johnson and landed on him. That testimony was scheduled for November 22, 1963. Here is the provable record of who Lyndon Baines Johnson was: the documented corruption, the private racism, the war profiteering, the personal cruelty, built fact by fact, source by source, until conspiracy theories about what happened in Dallas become almost redundant. Because the verified record is already damning enough. To understand what Johnson stood to lose that November, you have to understand the machinery that built him. He'd won his Senate seat in the 1948 Democratic primary against Coke Stevenson by 87 votes out of nearly 1 million cast. The margin came from Box 13 in Jim Wells County, where investigators determined that somebody had added 200 votes for Johnson that weren't legitimately cast. Names on the amended voter rolls appeared in alphabetical order, written in the same ink, in the same handwriting. Johnson's legal team, led by future Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, maneuvered through the courts to block a full investigation. Landslide Lyndon was never a compliment. The money behind that stolen election came from Brown and Root, the Texas construction firm that would later become KBR, a subsidiary of Halliburton. Brown and Root bankrolled Johnson's rise. Johnson steered government contracts back to them, a cycle of patronage that defined his entire career and would metastasize during Vietnam. By age 44, he was the youngest Senate Majority Leader in American history. His personal wealth had grown in ways that defied a public servant's salary. The family broadcasting empire, anchored by KTBC in Austin, benefited from FCC licensing decisions that conveniently favored Johnson's holdings. Government access converted into private gain, every single time. And now, in the autumn of 1963, all of it was about to come apart. The vice presidency had been a kind of exile. Kennedy's inner circle, particularly Bobby Kennedy, had fought against Johnson's inclusion on the ticket, and once in office, they marginalized him completely. Johnson had no real power. His scandals were metastasizing. The Senate investigation was gaining the kind of momentum that produces indictments. Sitting in that vice presidential office, Lyndon Johnson was staring at the end. Then came Dallas. At 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time on November 22, 1963, shots were fired at the presidential motorcade in Dealey Plaza. President Kennedy was struck in the head. He was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital at 1 p.m. In Washington, the Senate Rules Committee session was interrupted. Don Reynolds' testimony, The testimony that was about to connect Bobby Baker's corruption directly to the vice president was suspended. It would never be delivered as originally intended. The man facing potential criminal prosecution was now, by constitutional succession, about to become the most powerful person on Earth. What happened aboard Air Force One at Love Field is captured in one of the most studied photographs in American history. White House photographer Cecil Stoughton positioned himself in the cramped central compartment. At 2:38 p.m., less than 2 hours after Kennedy was pronounced dead, Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office, administered by federal judge Sarah T. Hughes. Lady Bird Johnson stood to his left. Jacqueline Kennedy stood to his right. Jackie was still wearing the pink Chanel suit from the motorcade. The suit was saturated with her husband's blood and brain matter. She had refused to change. Kennedy's body lay in a casket in the rear compartment of the same aircraft. Stoughton's photograph captures Johnson with his right hand raised, his jaw set, his expression fixed in what might be called grim resolve. But the image that has burned itself into American consciousness across 6 decades has nothing to do with Johnson's face. Jackie stands slightly behind the new president, her eyes hollow, her posture rigid with the mechanical compliance of someone in deep shock. The bloodstains on her suit function as a silent accusation no historian has contextualized away. She had been cradling her husband's shattered skull less than 2 hours earlier. Now she was standing beside the man who replaced him, positioned for a camera. There was no constitutional requirement that Johnson take the oath aboard Air Force One while Kennedy's body was still in the rear compartment. He could have waited until Washington. He could have taken it at the White House, at a dignified remove from the carnage. Instead, he chose to do it immediately, on the plane, on the tarmac, with the casket loaded and the widow beside him, and a photographer stationed to document the moment. A man whose career had been built on stolen elections, buried investigations, and the relentless seizure of every available advantage was behaving exactly as his biography predicted. Power unclaimed is power vulnerable. Lyndon Johnson had never once in his life left power sitting on a table. Bobby Kennedy learned of his brother's death at his home in McLean, Virginia. J. Edgar Hoover delivered the news by telephone with what witnesses described as cold, almost casual efficiency. The subsequent news of the swearing-in, Johnson taking the oath with Jackie beside him, aboard the plane carrying his dead brother, landed on Bobby Kennedy with a force that transcended grief. The man Bobby had spent years trying to keep at arm's length, whose closest associate was the subject of an active criminal corruption investigation, was now the President of the United States. Bobby Kennedy, Attorney General, whose job was enforcement of federal law, was now subordinate to Lyndon Johnson. American government had inverted completely in less than 3 hours. The first order of business for the new president was suffocation. The Senate Rules Committee investigation into Bobby Baker didn't formally end after November 22nd, but the political will to pursue a corruption probe against a sitting president, one who'd just assumed office in national tragedy, wrapping himself in Kennedy's legacy and the country's grief, simply dissolved. Reynolds did eventually provide testimony, but Johnson was no longer a vulnerable vice president whose career a Senate committee could end. He was the president. On December 6, 1963, 14 days after taking office, Johnson was recorded on his own White House taping system discussing efforts to suppress Reynolds' testimony. His concern, captured in his own voice, that it might spread to a place where we don't want it spread. 14 days in, already burying the investigation that had been about to bury him. Baker's probe resulted in a 1967 conviction for tax evasion, theft, and conspiracy to defraud the government. But it never reached Johnson. The threads leading to the vice president were severed by the assassination's disruption of momentum, by Johnson's active suppression on tape, and by the raw political reality that the ecosystem had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity, with every interest in its own protection. With domestic threats neutralized, Johnson turned to the project that would define his presidency and destroy a generation. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 provided the pretext. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave him congressional authorization. Beginning in March 1965, Johnson launched an escalation that would put more than 500,000 American soldiers in Southeast Asia. The instrument of that escalation was a single sheet of paper that arrived in mailboxes across the country, bearing words that scarred millions of families. Greetings. You are hereby ordered for induction into the Armed Forces of the United States. Each notice bearing his name and his personal signature authority. The draft pulled 2.2 million men into military service during Vietnam. The burden fell overwhelmingly on working-class and minority communities, sons of families who lacked resources to secure deferments or connections to arrange safe postings. Troop levels tell the escalation story in numbers Johnson personally authorized, from 23,000 in 1964 to 184,000 in 1965, then 385,000 in 1966, then 485,000 in 1967. Each increase was a deliberate choice to pour more American lives into a conflict his own intelligence apparatus told him couldn't be resolved militarily. Johnson personally selected bombing targets from the White House, poring over maps with the obsessive micromanagement of a man who trusted no one. More than 58,000 Americans died. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, confirmed what Johnson's own advisors had been telling him for years. The war was unwinnable, and the administration had systematically deceived the American public about its trajectory. A draft notice was a decision. A casualty was the consequence. And the man making those decisions had spent the previous autumn facing criminal charges for corruption. Now the prosecution pivots from personal cruelty to financial motive, because the war that destroyed a generation also enriched the network that built Johnson's career. Brown & Root, the same Texas firm that had bankrolled Johnson's political rise from his earliest campaigns, the same firm that funded the stolen 1948 election, received massive military contracts during the Vietnam escalation. Brown & Root built military bases, airstrips, ports, and logistics infrastructure across South Vietnam. Billions of dollars in government contracts flowed to a corporation whose financial relationship with the president stretched back 30 years. Their Vietnam contracts ranked among the largest awarded to any single firm during the entire conflict. The Johnson family's own financial holdings, including investments connected to defense industries, appreciated during the war years in ways that tracked the escalation timeline with uncomfortable precision. The man who signed the draft notices maintained documented financial connections to the companies that profited from the war those draftees were sent to fight. Eisenhower had warned the nation about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. Johnson was the fulfillment of that warning, the specific, concrete example made real in body bags and Brown & Root invoices. Historians credit Johnson with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Great Society programs expanded healthcare, education, and the social safety net. That is the standard positive assessment, and it's noted. While publicly positioning himself as the champion of civil rights, signing legislation and televised ceremonies, invoking the moral language of the movement, Johnson's private language told a different story. His routine use of severe racial slurs against Black Americans is documented in his own secret White House audio recordings. These weren't slips or isolated lapses. They were habitual. In private conversations with senators like Richard Russell, Johnson deployed the ugliest language in the American vocabulary, with the casualness of a man who'd never stopped to reconsider it. As a Texas senator from 1949 to 1961, Johnson had actively opposed major civil rights legislation, including efforts to strengthen the 1957 Civil Rights Act. His voting record before the presidency tracked perfectly with Southern Democratic orthodoxy. The man who signed the Civil Rights Act in the East Room in 1964 was the same man who'd spent decades voting against civil rights protections when it served his political interests in Texas. The shift wasn't moral evolution. It was strategic calculation from a man who had never in his life done anything without calculating the return. Johnson conducted meetings from the toilet, forcing staff to take dictation while he defecated. He pulled his beagles up by their ears on the White House lawn, in front of photographers. He exposed himself to staff and reporters, referring to his anatomy with a nickname he apparently found amusing. Robert Caro's biographical volumes document a pattern of personal dominance and cruelty that stretched across decades. The physical intimidation of colleagues, the public humiliation of subordinates, the treatment of Lady Bird Johnson that multiple witnesses described in terms that went well beyond political partnership. These weren't rumors traded by political opponents. They were documented by a biographer working from hundreds of interviews and thousands of documents. Bobby Kennedy watched all of this. He'd fought to keep Johnson off the 1960 ticket. He'd served as Attorney General with direct visibility into Johnson's network, Baker's operations, and the corruption investigations closing in. When his brother was killed and Johnson seized the presidency within hours, taking the oath beside Jackie in her blood-stained suit, then immediately working to suppress the investigation that had been about to expose him, Bobby Kennedy wasn't processing a political setback. He was watching something he recognized for exactly what it was. So here is the factual sequence, laid end to end without commentary, because the facts don't require it. In October 1963, the Bobby Baker investigation is escalating toward Johnson. A key witness, Don Reynolds, is scheduled to testify on November 22nd. On that morning, Reynolds prepares for his Senate appearance. That afternoon, Kennedy is killed in Dallas. Johnson takes the oath of office within 2 hours, aboard the plane carrying Kennedy's body. Within 14 days, Johnson is recorded on tape working to suppress the Reynolds testimony. The Baker investigation loses momentum and never reaches Johnson. The Billie Sol Estes exposure evaporates. Johnson assumes unchecked executive power and launches a war that enriches the construction firm that built his political career, sending 2.2 million drafted Americans into a conflict the Pentagon Papers confirm he knew was unwinnable. More than 58,000 of them die. Brown and Root collects billions. Johnson's family holdings appreciate. The man who couldn't win an election without stuffing a ballot box in Jim Wells County, who couldn't accumulate wealth without manipulating FCC licenses, who couldn't maintain relationships without domination and cruelty, who couldn't discuss Black Americans in private without reaching for the worst word in the language. That man became the President of the United States on the afternoon his criminal investigation was scheduled to advance. And the investigation never recovered. The prosecution rests. The jury can reach its own verdict. Subscribe for more stories like this.